Room for improvement is a statement that can go multiple ways. In this case, it's the veiled threat that is being made at Sony's financial reporting, and it's being made at Bungie. Bungie are in the firing line of PlayStation's incoming leadership, which is pretty major. Bungie themselves are reckoning with a very tumultuous 12 months. They've had brutal layoffs that have stripped quite a lot of their talent. That has happened across PlayStation. Now PlayStation are very much turning their gaze on the management of Bungie. In and around the same time, the PlayStation is seeing hardware kind of slow down. They're seeing decreased profit margin. This is honestly pretty brutal stuff. So, let's see, have Bungie management been doing a good enough job? What about the same for PlayStation? And to help me do a decent job, here's today's sponsor, who are going to help us all think a bit more sharp. And if you want to learn those high-paying superpower STEM fields like data science, computer science, mathematics, well, you can learn by doing with brilliant.org/Bellular News, where the first 200 to click my link get 20% off an annual plan and where they've got a 30-day free trial. So, here's my highlight. It's a course called How Technology Works. It's awesome. I mean, capacitors, transistors. You've probably heard of them. Would you like to know what they are and how they work? How about passwords? GPS, actually learning how the things around you function, gaining a true understanding of the world. Yeah, honestly, I just picked this one because it's fun and it perfectly showcases what Brilliant does best, interactively breaking down big, complex things into small, easy to understand things, and doing that with their bite-sized quiz-based format across their app and the web, which is so damn good. Because look, when I was at school and university, it was the old way. Textbooks, lectures. Personally, I've always learned by doing. That's exactly what Brilliant is geared towards. I know that it would have been a better way for my younger self. You see, Brilliant is self-paced and it is designed to meet you where you are at, and with thousands of lessons, with more being added every month, they have got the material to fit you. Look, I just think it's a terrific product. I think their mission is fantastic, and you can check them out. The first 200 to click my link at brilliant.org/Bellular News get 20% off an annual plan, and of course, you can try out that 30-day free trial. Okay, let's get into things. Now, as you know, Jim Ryan is no longer the leader of PlayStation. The new guy, right? Hiroki Totoki, I believe is how you pronounce his name. He is currently the COO and CFO, right? So he's going to be taking leadership. And that basically is why the comments from him at their earnings call were just really something interesting, because yes, there's the stuff about Bungie, but also just what he's saying about Sony Interactive Entertainment as an overall group. It is interesting and certainly rather revealing. So there was a lot of comments last week, but then what happened is the translation, like the official English translation, went up. And from that, VGC spotted two questions in particular that are just very interesting about the PlayStation Studios. Now, the first is about his observations of Sony Interactive Entertainment as just an overall group. We've already covered that loading screen, by the way, link below, but basically he framed it as this. They have a solid understanding of what optimization means when it comes to their individual fields of responsibility. However, they don't necessarily understand how their respective efforts tie into overall growth, sustainable profit generation, and higher margins. Now, that is, of course, a very diplomatic way of saying things, but to actually break that statement down, he's basically saying people are doing a good job, but they're kind of doing a good job in their own little corner, and we have problems when it comes to overall growth, sustainable profit, and higher margins. Of course, their margins have been decreasing, right? There was times their margins used to be in, the sort of range of like 12%. Now they're 6%. So obviously having your margins half is going to be very worrying to a business. If you've been wondering why they've been interested in cost cutting, well, that essentially is, one of the reasons. What he's basically going to is the idea that individual management teams are not appreciating how they contribute to the wider PlayStation unit and how their efforts impact other teams. Now, when we think back to, say, the Insomniac hack that we covered just over Christmas there, well, they were told to cut staff numbers, and essentially in some of what we've learned, their CEO said that was going to really cause a problem, right, when it comes to reducing those costs, but also not doing so by removing a lot of your better, more tenured, kind of experienced talent. Now, this wider point about the margins and the sustainable profit, that can be read, I think, very negatively, right? I mean, We've got the widespread allegation that PlayStation is already cutting about 10% of staff from individual studios within the Sony Interactive Entertainment Group. They've seemingly also cancelled projects like the one at Deviation Games. Deviation was a studio founded by ex-Treyarch people. A lot of the word in the street is that they were trying to sort of have their own Call of Duty thing. Whatever happened, though, that project seems to have died. Deviation seems to have been rather gutted, and this is something that is also playing into the idea of them and the live services. Obviously, I think it was 12 they said they wanted to have out by fiscal year 2026. They have since had that target be halved, which, yeah, it's pretty damn painful. Of course, then the other side of that is making more money out of what they've already produced, right? It's another good way to get your profit up. This is actually something that even Phil Spencer fairly recently was talking about, I believe, in his interview with The Verge. Basically, it's him saying, look, you know, when we release games on other platforms, we make more money. That's what they were talking about. Now, obviously, there's the whole side with exclusives. Obviously, Microsoft will be playing down exclusives because it's an area where they're not particularly as strong. But the core idea of putting your game in more places so you can earn more money by selling that game, yeah, that's obviously fairly important. Now, for Sony, they've always wanted to have the sort of tier one, walled garden that is doing everything on the PlayStation, but they have basically been moving away from that. Like, one of the things that they have seen is, in a way, softening console demand. Console demand is not as high as it used to be in the previous generation, and yes, they did sell actually quite a few units over the last year, but they had to do quite a lot of discounting to achieve that. So if they're basically realizing that the growth curve on their console sales is declining, well, how are you going to get new users? Probably the likes of PC, which obviously we've seen them do, and we've seen them do that to fantastic success with Helldivers 2. Now, previously, it had been understood that these were generalized comments, right? Turns out, though, when we got the updated, the proper translation of the pre-approved Q&A questions, well, one of them was specifically about Bungie. That's where it gets fairly interesting. The question is this: please give us an update on Bungie and what initiatives you are planning for fiscal year 2024. And here is what he says in response. I visited the Bungie studios and had meetings with the management, and I saw that employees working at the studios were highly motivated, showing great creativity as well as impressive knowledge of live services. Now, you've probably heard of the idea of a turd sandwich, so yes, this is very much the first bit that is good. What I do appreciate, though, is a tone that is respecting and appreciating the efforts of workers, and it does seem that overall his management approach here is talking a lot more about leadership and management, which absolutely, I think, is where, I suppose blame is the right word, but that's where the pressure should be located. Now, to continue what he said, however, I also felt there was room for improvement from a business perspective with regard to areas such as the use of business expenses and assuming accountability for development timelines. I hope to continue the dialogue and come up with some good solutions. Now, it's one of those things, right? If somebody is going to, go shouting and screaming, super angry or whatever, usually it's because they don't really have, power. It's a sort of an insecurity thing. So whenever you read this, right, whenever you read that he said this, you think, oh shit, this guy's got real power. He's a real goddamn operator. He can actually make changes. So it's that sort of thing. Whenever the threats are there in polite language like this, that's when they take on a chilling tone, sort of in my opinion. That said, I'm obviously not disagreeing with him. I don't have the numbers that he has. So let's try and just break this one down. Now, obviously, if you are a fan of Destiny 2, I mean, hey, I commend your ability to stick with it, and I get it too. I've been like that with games before, and it's always that thing with Destiny. It's one of those games that's always on the cusp of greatness, and sometimes it actually is finding that greatness with Witch Queen. But yes, as is the story with many live games, it's really hard to keep that bar of quality up. Now, if you're a fan of that game, I mean, you've had to deal with so many issues. Say, monetization in the game, how that's been going. Of course, Bungie having significant layoffs, how they were allegedly on the cusp of being taken over by PlayStation, how they've been forced to delay the final shape, and of course then the departure of the game director. So this probably does feel like a lot of salt poured on the wound. Now, just remember that thing about them being taken over by PlayStation. The allegation is that Bungie, when acquired, were allowed to essentially operate as a very independent unit, right? They were just doing their thing. But the allegation is that Sony would have quite a bit of power to move in and take control if Bungie didn't hit certain revenues or performance milestones or metrics. Now that's spooky, but I think it's extra spooky when you hear that they were looking at a 45% decrease in revenue from what they had expected and projected, right? So to me, that really is a spooky thing. So to continue from that, I suppose credit to the boss of SIE for saying that these employees are doing a great job. For management, though, this comes off as being absolutely scathing, absolutely brutal. And indeed, when you look at so many of the problems that they have faced, even with Destiny 2, you could certainly say that quite a lot of them do look self-inflicted. I mean, it is just impossible to read the phrasing here of the use of business expenses and assuming accountability for development timelines as basically anything other than a public rebuke of at least what has happened under that leadership, especially just the line, assuming accountability. So they're saying that, assuming accountability, but then one of the previous questions was talking about how teams and people are doing a good job, but they don't necessarily appreciate how much or basically what they're doing, what that means for the overall group. So it's kind of saying here that on the level of Bungie, they are irresponsible with their allocation of budget, they're irresponsible with how they manage timelines, and then on the larger side of things, that they also essentially don't really appreciate how important they actually are to SIE's overall growth. That is rough stuff. Now, it is being communicated in a very polite way, but my god, that is pretty damn brutal. Now, obviously, Bungie and delays, they've had many, thinking, Shadowkeep, that there's been quite a few. The final shape, of course, that's been delayed, and ultimately, that's part of their decision-making, right? They evidently failed to manage the scope of that project. Leaks say that Marathon has been delayed from 2024 to 2025. Pretty challenging. And obviously then from the management of the group, this is all just bad. This is underperforming. Maybe a new expansion being a bit late would be okay if current revenue is fine. But if one of the more recent things that we heard of was a 45% underperformance versus the benchmarks they set for themselves, and surely those benchmarks will have been, will have basically been extrapolated from past expansions, right? Past numbers, past data. That is absolutely brutal. If your current numbers aren't going to buy you any latitude and then you've had to delay everything, clearly it'll just get to the point where the wider group will kind of just have enough. They'll have had enough of the BS, of the shenanigans, because that revenue actually matters to them. Again, remember Spider-Man 2 cost north of $300 million, and it was actually at such a state where it would need to sell, I believe, 7.2 million copies at full price in order to break even. Now that is absolutely crazy. And what are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about margin. One of Sony's problems is, they've discounted a bunch of consoles to try to keep the sales going. Their margins have been decreasing. A lot of their big bets, like, say, new Spider-Man game, they do absolutely fantastic, but they're so goddamn expensive that they need to do fantastic. So yes, there's no wonder why the belt is tightening. Let's just do some of the big sort of top-line numbers for the quarter. Sales are up year over year by 16% to $63 billion. Operating income is down 15% to $6.5 billion. And the PSN MAUs are up to 123 million, which is up 11 million year over year, but they do not separately report on any PS Plus info. And when that happens, as with Microsoft, usually it is a decline. We recently found out that Game Pass is at 34 million, that it essentially has been stagnating. I think a lot of that massive growth, like at the start of COVID, that is obviously tapered off. So we're kind of seeing these struggles existing for all of the companies. Now, when it comes to some of the other things, like, say, console sales, it's not as bad for Sony as it is for Microsoft. So essentially they did a lot of promotions, right, for the PlayStation 5, and that means that obviously less profit. However, the actual number of consoles sold increased to 8.2 million from 7.1 million in the same period last year. So they're still shifting units. That's really good, but they're doing so with worse unit economics. Now, third-party sales and DLC, those were up, but first-party sales were down. Of course, that's because in 2022, you had God of War Ragnarok launching, in that window, it sold 11 million in 10 weeks. Obviously, there's Spider-Man 2 there for 2023, but still, it was weaker. And that overall means that Sony have been forced to lower their projections. They're expecting their sales to drop by 5% from when they were, and they say this is mostly a result of hardware depreciating overall, essentially meaning that for them as a group, they've now entered a transition state from their seemingly uncontested power position going in, right? I mean, to get it from the horse's mouth, Mr. Totoki said that the PS5 is entering the latter half of the console cycle, right? 5th year in, and they are expecting unit sales to decrease. And that does actually mean that the sales curve this time around is not as strong as it was in the previous era of the PS4. That, to be honest, is fascinating to me because, and I will say this for the Xbox as well, yes, it doesn't have as good games because of the exclusives, but both of those consoles are goddamn marvelous compared to what we were used to. But anyway, because of all this, the sales goals for the PS5 are down from 25 million to 21 million, with that deficit already appearing in the last quarter. Of course, that mirrors Xbox's complaints, right? Xbox are basically saying like, hey, we're doing discounts, we're doing all we can, and we still cannot shift the consoles. Obviously, it's a way worse situation for Microsoft with Xbox, but Sony are feeling it too, and that does mean it is also just a broader market trend. Now, to get a bit more insight, let's go to two analysts. First, right, we've got Takashi Mochizuki, who is an analyst, works with Bloomberg, who has said Sony said drastic price cuts on the PS5, similar to what they did in the PS4, is difficult as room is limited to cut production costs of the PS5 versus the PS4. That's fairly interesting to me. Obviously, a lot of these fabs are very busy. Like, I don't know exactly what part, what sort of parts of the process they would be, looking at to get their costs down. But certainly thinking about a lot of the news stories like AI booms and all of that, you do just sort of wonder, like, is the price of fabs just sort of increasing and increasing? Is there more demand for that? But whatever's going on, point is they do not have as much room there. Now, there are rumors, of course, of a PlayStation 5 Pro that could even be coming out quite soon indeed. That's very interesting because honestly, the PS5 is fantastic. If there was a Pro of that, I actually think that would be a pretty exciting sort of concept, really. But if they're doing a Pro, they can probably aim for higher margins. And perhaps if they were able to just have more pros in their sales mix, they would be able to just try to increase their volume a little bit more with just regular old PS5s. Not exactly sure. But anyway, moving on, we've got some analysis from Daniel Ahmad. As an aside, this is also why PlayStation started expanding to PC, live services, and is exploring mobile and cloud. PS5 sales are slightly behind PS4 in the same time frame, and PS Plus subscriptions aren't growing much. Hence why there's been a push for higher spending on the PS5 Plus, expanding the ecosystem beyond PS5. Now, this is, again, interesting because basically, Microsoft are more strategically forward-looking here. That's the bit that I find to be really fascinating. Microsoft, when I say that, what I basically mean is they've been in a losing position for consoles for a very long time. So because of that, and because they're still going to be hungry for success, they're going to be working out like, okay, shit, we really cannot be that successful with console. What on earth do we do to rectify this situation? Now, for Microsoft, they have some fairly amazing strengths. Like, isn't Azure basically? I mean, AWS is the big one, but I think Azure is second to AWS now in cloud. Basically, the point is Microsoft are an absolute titan in quite a lot of those spaces. So that's why you've seen Microsoft go so hard towards cloud, why they're kind of going with this, or even Sarah Bond, basically saying that if it has a screen, we're considering it an Xbox. What we see here then for both sides is essentially a lack of organic growth in their core business, which is why they now have got to try to get organic growth going elsewhere via Game Pass, via, cloud, via all of those things, just going as hard as they can. So that's basically the situation. The organic console growth is slowing down, they need to grow elsewhere. I mean, even look at some of Phil Spencer's recent comments, like even about Helldivers, which is what Ahmad is sort of talking in relation to partially, where Helldivers 2 did amazingly, right? And it's done amazingly on PC. You then had Phil Spencer talking about like, well, Helldivers 2, I mean, I don't see how it benefits by not being on an Xbox. And the point there basically is, well, yeah, like Phil, Microsoft is way far behind, right? They're always you're going to be the person who will disproportionately benefit from the market incumbents loosening up the their walled garden. So it is an interesting thing. Everybody moving onto PC makes absolute sense, but Sony moving onto Xbox, that obviously makes a hell of a lot less sense. For Microsoft, though, them moving to Sony does make sense because ultimately they need to increase their revenue, get better margins by selling more copies, and they are severely hamstrung by just how small the core Xbox player base is. I mean, it's still massive in the millions, but it's just not as many millions as what Sony have. On the games themselves then, Sony are in a position where they really do need to rely on their big premium third-party partners, right? The likes of, say, Square Enix for, the new Final Fantasy. The same for Konami as well. But like even at the latest State of Play, yeah, they've got games with Kojima Productions, but those things don't have dates. Then when you look at a lot of their existing franchises, well, they've said that they're not going to, have things in fiscal year 25, which means from now until April 2025. In that span of time, you're going to have no God of War Ragnaroks, no Spider-Man 2s. They won't have those really big first-party, just massive games. So instead, it'll be whatever trickle of live service stuff they have, and then third parties. Now, on the live services, they've got the likes of Fair Games, Concord, there's other unrevealed live services, third-party exclusives, and maybe some new IP like Intergalactic, the Heretic Prophet, whatever that might be, because it is just a trademark that they recently filed. So we'll see if that comes to fruition, but the basic point here is they're having a lot of the same problems that Microsoft are having, where it just takes so goddamn long to make a video game these days that, well, how the hell do you make enough of them? Like, look at the number of studios that all these companies have, and then look at how long it takes to make games. I mean, even if you want to be a bit mean and joking, you could say, think about the Initiative, the quadruple A Xbox studio, and many other things. Like, how long have Playground been making that Fable game? We're getting to the stage where, I mean, if average games are taking 7 or 8 years to make, what does that mean for people's portfolios? So a lot of this does seem like it's going to be struggling when it comes to financial viability. Like, the sheer scale of games just does feel, well, far too big for their own good. That being said, there is one thing to help out all of the industry, but to disproportionately help Sony, and of course, that's GTA 6. Remember, GTA 6 is not sim shipping on PC, and obviously, with PlayStation being far, far, far larger, yeah, they are going to make a stupid amount of money from just taking their store cut of GTA 6. So that'll be pretty awesome for them, and realistically, if they did have a really big game in their portfolio, why would they release it in and around GTA 6? All of that gamer money is going to be going to GTA 6. And again, to look at like operating income and how they can sort of get that up there. Again, Spider-Man 2, well, they've said it sold 10 million copies by February 4th. It needed 7 million to break even. So that is a game that, has got past its break even point. But the thing is, the stakes are so high that they need to do that. Again, think about that Insomniac leak and what we learned from that. Just how high the stakes are. It's that sort of thing where, take an Activision Blizzard, because I'm just going to say Activision because I think it's something we can all understand. Remember when Activision used to have a lot of games, right? And then they just turned into the Call of Duty studio, or the Call of Duty publisher. In a way, that was really successful for them because they pared back in the stuff that didn't move the needle, they focused everything on what would move the needle, and there you go, absolutely fantastic. The thing is though, if all your eggs are in the Call of Duty basket, and then Call of Duty enters a stage of decline, well, your bet is so big, and if you sort of think about how correlated your investments are to like various risks, well, the fewer eggs you've got in the basket, the more correlated all those things are going to be. And that means that if one thing just really doesn't do well, you're in big, big trouble. Like, if you have a Skull and Bones, at least hope the Singaporean government threw a bunch of money and incentives in to soften the blow. But the point basically is, like, if Spider-Man 3 or whatever their next thing is going to be costing that tier of money, but it just underperforms by like 20%, well, the financial stakes and the numbers are so high that that is going to be absolutely brutal. And that's why Totoki is saying things like this. Strong titles that achieve growth on PS5, PCs, and other platforms will widen our margins. We believe that we have opportunities for margin improvement and intend to pursue them aggressively. So, again, one of those things. A lot of the time we would talk in the industry about loss leaders, about first-party incentives being sort of different from third-party incentives, where what do the third parties need? They need money, they need it now. But often for the first parties, they're willing to take hits. They're willing to sell a console at a loss or at break-even because they need to increase their install base. They're willing to put a lot of money into console exclusives and be happy to limit their sales potential by having them be exclusive because they need to grow their install base, because that's the business. But I suppose that's more of an early generation thing. Now the trends are basically set. Xbox ain't coming for you, right? Like, Xbox is not going to, in any meaningful way, be able to attack Sony for the rest of this console gen. So from Sony's perspective then, well, why focus on growth and lowering our margins when we could just sort of exploit the thing we've built and actually make more money? They end up having all of these video games that are just not sitting on Steam or PC and therefore can't be played by that audience. Well, okay, you've already got all your gains, really, for your own platform. How about you just get millions more sales over here? Because for most of these games, they've already achieved what they needed to in PlayStation. Anything else is it's just dessert, right? But it's something that they need to do because their financial performance is not where they need it to be. Again, 6% margin. They used to be at more like 12%. So they're not going to be happy with that. So this is suggesting then that they'll be finding new ways to get their games out to people. PC, mobile, cloud. They don't need to do that on other consoles. There is really no good reason for them to say put Spider-Man on an Xbox, because basically, why would you do that? Why would you increase the strength of Xbox for really not that many sales in return? Because Xbox is fairly small. I mean, I still think it would be millions. I still think they would make money, but ultimately they are in such a strong walled garden position in the console market that there's absolutely no way that you would consider breaking that up. So overall then, what this means is belts are tightening and they need to make more money from more things. More games going multi-plat onto PC, more plays perhaps, like the Helldivers play. And certainly for Bungie, maybe Bungie are going to be under some more scrutiny. Again, the way that he said, and I look forward to continued, dialogue and cooperation with them on this. I mean, yes, those are polite words, but if I was management at Bungie, I would be feeling a tingle go up my spine. The final shape better be a Witch Queen. If it ain't, then, well, a lot of those polite words that were said about management, well, we know they have a harder edge, and I think we know where that harder edge will be going if Final Shape doesn't hit the sorts of goals for SIE that they would want. Very interesting indeed. Right, that's it for today's video. I'd recommend you check out Brilliant. They're today's sponsor. They're really awesome, so that's down below. Other than that, though, we are at least 5 videos a week. We do try to make it 6 or 7 when we can, so stay tuned for more of that. You can check out the video that will appear above my head next. When publishing it, I will have chosen it as a good follow-up video to this one. Okay, have a good day. I'll see you over there.